Today I'm going to show you how to build this simple coffee table out of leftover scrap pieces. I tend to keep a lot of sort of medium-sized offcuts from various projects in this lumber storage cart. And I always have the intentions, or maybe pipe dreams, that I'm going to eventually do something with them. Now, I hate the idea of waste, so I don't want to just toss them, but I also hate the idea of clutter, so I don't want to keep everything and let it pile up. So this week I was going through my stash, and I picked out a few pieces that, if I'm being honest with myself, probably aren't going to make their way into any of my new builds, and decided to use them to make this little coffee table. After I'd selected all the pieces that I was going to use, the first thing that I needed to do was bring them to an even thickness for my top. So I started off by joining each piece on one face and one edge. Next I took them over to the planer, where I brought them all down to an even thickness of just a bit over 3/4 of an inch. After that, I set my table saw to 1.5 inches and ripped out a few strips. Then I used a few of those strips side by side and ripped some other pieces at 3 inches, 4.5 inches, and 6 inches. And to be honest, I'm not sure that my pieces were those exact dimensions, but what's really most important is that you have your baseline width, which theoretically is 1.5 inches for me, and then the pieces are your baseline times 2, times 3, and so on. Next I got out my crosscut sled and cut off the edge of each piece so that I'd get rid of anything that was checking, and so that everything would have a nice 90-degree edge on it. And then I cross-cut all of my pieces to what were pretty much just random lengths. After that, I took all of my pieces to my workbench and started playing around with different layouts until I landed on something that I liked. So once I had it there, I marked my remaining pieces where I could cross-cut them to length, and then use those offcuts plus a few other unused scraps to come back and fill in any holes in the top. And this is where having those set widths of 1.5 inches, 3 inches, 4.5 inches, and 6 inches came in really handy. Basically, I didn't need to worry about any gaps in terms of width, only length. I think I also ended up making a top that looked random, but somehow still clean and modern. Finally, once I had my layout done, I marked everything for order, and then I could glue it all together. After it was dry, I cut the top to its final length and width, and filled in any gaps that I had with some of the leftover scrap, and then I could turn my attention to the base. Though actually, as you see in a minute, there's still going to be a lot that we have to do at the top because there ended up being some problems. But anyhow, we'll get back to that. So to kick off the base, I headed over to the table saw where I ripped my stock into pieces that are 1.25 inches wide for the legs and 1/2 inch wide for the stretcher and aprons. For the legs, I wanted them to be perfectly square, so after I'd cut them to their width, I rotated them 90 degrees and then cut them again so that I would have the thickness. And then, like I said, for the stretchers and aprons, they're going to be 1/2 inch thick and 1.25 inches wide. Next, I used my crosscut sled to cut my legs to their finished length. But I held off on cutting the stretchers and the aprons until after I did more work on the top so that I could take relative measurements to cut all of those. So back to the top, by now my gap filling pieces were dry enough that I could cut off the excess material and sand everything flush. And while I was doing this, I had a realization that I was going to have to do a lot of sanding. Basically, edge gluing so many pieces without any biscuits or dominoes or cauls made for a lot of mismatched edges, and I figured since the top was already made of a bunch of strips, why not just rip the table in half, write down the glue line of where the strip was, send the pieces through the planer a couple times, and then glue the two halves back together. So that's what I did. So in doing that, I cut the top back below those gap filler pieces I had made, And I figured since this was kind of an experimental piece anyways, I'd just mix up some sawdust from the table saw and the planer with some glue and rub it in all the gaps to see how that would come out. And I'll show you some pictures towards the end of the video so you'll see the finished results. The last thing that I wanted to do to the top for now was put this little 1/4 inch rabbet along the bottom edge of all 4 sides. Okay, back to the base. Before we start building anything, let me quickly show you how this thing's gonna come together so that you can get your bearings. So we have our 4 legs, obviously, 1 at each corner. And let's get rid of the top for a second so you can see the base in more detail. So the initial plan was to have 4 stretchers at the very top of the legs, just under the top, and then this H-shaped series of 3 pieces for aprons. Or maybe it's I-shaped. In any case, in the final piece, I had to move these short stretchers down because the joints were going to intersect with one another. And if I'm being honest, this was just the less laborious decision. But actually kind of like the way that it came out. Alright, so I clamped up my legs at the distance that I wanted them to ultimately be, and then used that to mark and cut my stretcher pieces to length. And as you're going to see in a minute, I ran into a few issues with the base because of bad decisions that I made and kind of immediately regretted. But you know what I've never regretted? Any of my clothing choices from Mack Weldon. No, but seriously. I've got sweats, socks, shirts, long sleeve too, and even underwear from them. And I really do love them all. I wear them to relax, for work, to the gym, basically everywhere. And that's because they're super comfortable and they fit really well, which are pretty much my only 2 requirements, so double check. So seriously, if you're in the market for some new clothes or gift ideas, I really do highly recommend you check them out. I'll put a link in the description. They have a really nicely edited selection of pieces, so everything that they offer is really simple and nice. And right now you can even save 20% if you use the offer code 4eyes. So again, link in the description. Right. Thanks, Mack Weldon. So my initial thought for joining the 1/2 inch thick pieces was pocket screws. And this would be fine, except for this joint right here, where the material's just too thin, or at least I thought. There, I thought it might be better to use a domino. So then I thought, well, then I might as well just use all dominoes. So I did that, but when I went to cut the mortises into the top of the legs, I didn't like the way it was registering, and I actually messed up one of the pieces really bad, as you can see here. And so I thought, let's go back to pocket screws for the leg attachments. So I headed back over to the table saw and removed the chewed up area of the leg, which is no big deal. It just means that the overall height of the coffee table is going to be about 1/4 inch lower than I had planned. And then I could go about pocket holing, sort of. First, I had to fill in the material I had already mortised so that there would be enough meat for the screws to grab onto. So I plugged them all up, and while they were drying, I glued the I-shaped stretcher together, and then came back and flush trimmed my filler pieces. And then, finally, I could get back to my initial idea, which I should have just gone with in the first place. If you guys watch my other videos, you know that I'm the kind of person that likes to really plan everything out before I start working on a project. And I know this one wasn't really anything wild, but it was definitely a little bit more improvised than what I'm used to. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that I had a few hiccups along the way. But I have to say, it was actually pretty fun, and in a weird way, kind of relaxing. And at the end of the day, while it certainly isn't the greatest thing that I've ever built, I don't think it looks like scrap. Thanks for watching and subscribing, and make sure to take a look at some of my other videos. Alright, see you in the next one.